Today, what I want to talk about is the subject of idolatry. Now, we're going to begin in a different way than usual. Let's see. We're going to begin with geography. Now, if you go into history, where did civilizations develop? They developed where there were rivers. And the same is true with the Middle East. Now, if you take a look at numbers, the Israelites were thinking about what life was like in Egypt. And they said, they remember the fish, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. Okay? They ate very well. And the reason why was because of the Nile River. The flow of the Nile River is very steady. Certain times of the year, the river level goes up. Other times of year, it subsides. And when it does that, what it does is brings rich soil. So along the Nile Valley, what you find is that the soil is very rich and they can grow a lot of crops. And so whenever there's a famine, you find people living in what we call Israel going down to Egypt because that's where the food is. Now, as we look at what happened when they moved into the promised land, you had the Jordan River, but it's nothing like the Nile. And they depended on rainfall in order to grow their crops. And there are going to be years where there's famine. And during those years, they had to go down into Egypt. So if you were a native of this land, you depended on the rain. And that's why you worship Baal and some of the other gods, because your life depends on it. You don't have refrigeration or anything like that. If there's no rain, you may starve. And so this is one reason why we find that there's such a prominence of idol worship as we look at life in the promised land. Now, we see this other story that deals with Baal and Asherah, okay, two gods. And you remember that Elijah went and he challenged these gods. And we find that they had 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. Okay? So these were gods that the people of the land worshiped. And as the Israelites settled into the land, they adopted these gods. Now, if you take a look at the 10 Commandments, we can very well understand some of them, but let's take a look at what happened. In verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Verse 23, you shall not make gods of silver to be with me, nor shall you make for yourself gods of gold. We could understand this. This was given to the people while they were wandering. But God knew what was going to happen when they entered into the promised land. And he warns them, this is something you are not to do, even though the people around you are doing it. Now, what happens? Moses is on the mount for quite a while. And the people say, he probably died. We don't know what happened to him. And so what happens? We have the incident of the golden calf. They say, this is the one that brought us out of Egypt. Now, if it gets worse, we find later in the history, Solomon builds a temple to God. After he passes away, something happens that we would not think would happen. We find in verse 4, talking about the king Manasseh, and he built altars in the house of the Lord, of which the Lord has said, in Jerusalem shall my name be forever. And he built altars for all the hosts of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. It wasn't that on the mountaintop somewhere, they built a temple for these gods. they brought these gods into the temple that Solomon had built. The very place they were to worship God, they put these idols. This is pretty bad. Now, in the New Testament era, things changed dramatically. The references that you find in the Old Testament about the gods is not common in the New Testament. What happened is that we have the Romans now in control of the land. Romans controlled the Mediterranean. There was the Roman peace. There was a lot more trade. And so the food situation was not as bad as it was in the Old Testament times. So the economy improved. We have the Roman gods brought in, but even they are not as prominent in the New Testament as we find in the Old Testament. What happened is that God judged the Israelites by sending them off to Babylon. They learned their lesson. And so when they came back, it was a new attitude. They recognized we have sinned against God. God punished us. We're not going to worship the gods to the same extent that they did before. So when the Roman gods were brought in, it did not attract the people as well as the gods of the Palestine during the Old Testament. Okay? We find that in Jesus' discussions, there's no mention of idolatry. Where you find mention of idolatry was when Paul went to other parts of the Roman Empire. And we'll take a look at some of these. So rejecting idolatry was also a characteristic of Christians. People knew that if you're a Christian, you don't worship idols. Now, we find an example of the warning that God gave to the people in Thessalonica. And it talks about the fact that you turn your allegiance to God, you now reject these idols that the population around you worship. I want to play this for you. And I'm not sure how to play this. Oh, okay, let me. Okay, Joe Osteen. If you ask Joe, what do you believe in terms of a doctrinal statement? You look at what he says he believes,